The striped awning flapped gently in the warm Midwestern wind, its faded red and white fabric casting restless shadows across the picnic tables lined up in the yard. Beneath it sat Lieutenant Commander Kiyoshi Nakahara, his posture rigid despite the heavy heat of late summer. His fingers, still calloused from the salt air of the Pacific, held an object so foreign it felt almost dangerous. A soft bun, warm and pliant, holding a pale brown sausage slick with some kind of yellow paste. Grease pooled lightly in the crease of the paper wrapping. To one side, a bottle of something dark and fizzy hissed quietly, beads of condensation forming in the still air. Across the yard, American guards lounged in easy clusters, their rifles slung casually, their caps tilted back, as if war belonged to another continent. They laughed and ate without caution, each bite taken with an ease that struck Nakahara as almost provocative. The sausage in bread, one of the guards had called it a hot dog, was devoured with loud, unguarded pleasure. A few prisoners nearby had accepted theirs and were staring, uncertain whether to follow suit. Some sniffed at the food suspiciously. Others simply placed it on the table untouched, as if proximity alone might compromise them. Nakahara studied the bun. It was warm, astonishingly so, as if baked minutes before. The sausage smelled faintly of smoke and spices he could not name. The yellow paste, mustard the guard had said, stung his nose. The officer's stomach, hollow after weeks of transport and meager rations, betrayed him with a low growl. Still he hesitated. Everything he had been taught warned him against this moment. Surrender was shame. Dependence was humiliation. To eat what the enemy offered felt like another step away from the world he had sworn to defend. A breeze lifted the awning again and carried with it the sound of easy banter among the guards. They were speaking quickly, laughing at some small joke about the baseball diamond just beyond the wire fence. The smell of grilled meat drifted stronger. Nakahara's mind wandered back to the months at sea, when his crew had eaten dried fish and hard rice that sometimes smelled faintly of mold. He thought of the sick men hunched over in narrow bunks, of the fear that had lived in their throats more faithfully than food ever had. And here was abundance so casual it felt like arrogance. A young guard walked past and offered another bottle of the dark drink, nodding politely but saying nothing. Nakahara glanced up, expecting mockery, but the man's face was neutral, almost friendly. He moved on without waiting for thanks. That small courtesy unsettled him more than cruelty would have. The first bite came almost by accident. One of the younger prisoners across from him, a deckhand from Saipan, tore into his hot dog suddenly, perhaps unable to resist any longer. His eyes widened. He chewed, swallowed, then took another bite. He muttered something low and fast. Maybe that it wasn't poisoned, maybe only that it was food. The others watched, waiting for a sign of danger. Nothing happened except that the boy's chewing slowed, then quickened again with surprising hunger. Nakahara brought the bun to his lips before he quite realized it. The bread was soft, sweet even, nothing like the coarse rolls he'd known. The sausage released a wave of salt, smoke, and fat that startled his tongue. He chewed slowly at first, testing, then with greater intent as his body betrayed him with relief. There was no hidden bitterness, no trace of cruelty, only meat, easy to swallow, filling in a way rice could never be. He looked up. Around him, the small experiment was repeating itself. Cautious bites, widened eyes, guarded men forced to acknowledge the simple fact of hunger. A few shook their heads in disbelief. One muttered a prayer. None of it felt like victory, but neither did it feel like defeat. It felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground where the rules were unclear. Beyond the fence, on the far side of the baseball field, 2 American soldiers were tossing a ball lazily back and forth, their gloves cracking softly in the late light. It struck Nakahara then that they were not worried. Not about food, not about supplies, perhaps not even about the war that had taken so much from his country. The sight filled him with something he could not yet name. Envy, maybe, or an ache sharper than hunger. He set the half-eaten hot dog down and ran his thumb along the paper wrapper, noting its clean fold, its uniform print. Even this, he realized, was mass-produced, simple, efficient, countless. Nothing about this meal was accidental. Someone, somewhere, had built a system so wide and sure that it could feed enemies in comfort thousands of miles from home. The officer sat back, his jaw still working slowly, the mustard bright on his tongue. He thought of the Emperor's voice he had yet to hear, the home island still standing but already burning. He thought of how deeply he had underestimated the people who could make war feel like this, organized, abundant, casual. The hot dog in his hand was only food, but it whispered of something larger, something his own nation had never built. Around him, other prisoners finished their meals in uneasy silence, glancing at the guards, at one another, at the horizon beyond the fences. The first bite had been taken. It would not be the last. The night had been full of fire and salt spray when Kiyoshi Nakahara was taken. He remembered the sky burning red above Saipan, the hiss of shells crossing black water, the air so thick with smoke that every breath tasted of ash. Surrender had not been a thought that lived easily in his mind. They had been raised on stories of loyalty so pure that a soldier's life was a small price for the Emperor's cause. Captivity was described as a stain worse than death, a betrayal of ancestors and family alike. Yet death had not come. The waves had carried him, half-conscious, to the shore where Marines waited with rifles lowered, eyes sharp, but not eager to kill. He had expected the end. Instead, rough hands pulled him from the surf and propped him against a rock. A medic crouched, spoke words he could not follow, and bound the gash in his shoulder with clean gauze. That alone unsettled him. No jeering, no boot against his ribs, only the brisk efficiency of men with another task to finish. They took his pistol and sword, but not his life. The next morning, a field hospital held him under canvas, smelling faintly of disinfectant and iodine. Nakahara was not alone. From Leyte and Iwo Jima came other captured men, sailors with salt-worn faces, young conscripts whose eyes seemed too wide for war, aviators shot from the sky and hauled bleeding from wreckage. Each had crossed the invisible line between death and surrender with a mixture of disbelief and shame. On transports bound east, they sat in silence, thin shoulders hunched, waiting for cruelty to arrive. They whispered of bamboo slivers under nails, of starvation rations, of humiliation designed to grind down spirit and body alike. The ships sailed on without delivering those things. There were guards, yes, rifles always present, but the young Americans moved with a calm that felt almost careless. They passed water in canteens, issued blankets when night air bit sharp. Some of the wounded were treated by Navy doctors with supplies that seemed endless. Bandages sealed in wax paper, bottles of clear medicine, steel instruments gleaming clean. The Japanese men accepted care warily, eyes averted, but the care came anyway. When they first glimpsed the American mainland, a stunned quiet passed among them. Wisconsin, Louisiana, Mississippi. The names meant little, but the sight of long, straight roads and square-built towns stirred something unfamiliar. They expected barbed wire and mud, but as trucks rumbled inland, the landscape turned gentle. Farm fields rolled out in perfect geometry, barns freshly painted, water towers standing like sentinels. By the time the convoy reached the first camp gate, exhaustion had dulled their fear enough to let astonishment slip in. The barracks waited in clean rows, boards planed smooth, windows intact and glass shining. There was electricity. At night, light bulbs glowed steady and white, where many of them had fought by lantern. Water ran from taps at a touch. Latrines smelled faintly of soap instead of the rot they had known. Beyond the perimeter fence lay fields kept as neat as gardens, lawns mowed close, gravel raked smooth. A baseball diamond chalked with perfect lines, though no game played yet. They were issued clothing, heavy cotton marked with PW, but new and whole. They were shown bunks with mattresses, thin but dry, and issued blankets that still held the scent of dye. The first meal came steaming and strange. Meat canned but tender, white bread so soft it tore under their fingers, vegetables bright as if summer had been preserved inside tin. Some refused to eat, suspicion clenched tight in their throats. Others, too hungry to resist, tasted cautiously and found no cruelty in the food, only fuel. Days passed. Order replaced dread, though shame lingered like an ache. Roll call, work details, evening curfews, all predictable, unmarked by violence. Guards barked instructions, but not insults. No one struck them without cause. The routines built a fragile, bewildering safety. Men who had fought until their ships sank beneath them now walked between barracks unarmed, yet unafraid of sudden death. In quiet corners, they wrestled with what this captivity meant. Some prayed, bowing heads low, struggling to reconcile survival with honor. Others watched the Americans and took note. Their easy laughter, their casual access to supplies, the way trucks arrived each day laden with goods that seemed to come from nowhere. The camps felt temporary yet solid, like small towns planted overnight. Letters, when permitted, went home in halting script. Some confessed nothing, offering only that the writer was alive. Others admitted confusion. The enemy does not starve us. We have light at night. We sleep on beds, always between the lines. There pulsed a quiet disbelief. Nakahara himself lay awake one night, listening to the hum of electric bulbs beyond the barracks door. He thought of his younger brother somewhere still fighting, of parents who might mourn him already. He wondered if living on the enemy's bread would make him unworthy to return. Yet he could not deny what his eyes saw, a world that treated captives with a kind of pragmatic decency, a nation so secure it could feed and house those who had tried to kill its sons. The shame of capture did not fade, but it bent under the weight of unexpected safety. These men, who had braced for punishment, found themselves housed, fed, and watched with cool discipline rather than hatred. They were not free, but neither were they condemned. In the quiet, after lights out, as crickets rasped beyond the fences, and the night smelled faintly of mown grass instead of blood, a new question crept into their hearts. What kind of country could wage such total war and still spare comfort for its enemies? The answer, they suspected, would take the rest of the war to understand. Long before the first prisoners saw the neat lines of barracks and the bright electric bulbs that lit them, the quiet machinery of America's war effort had been running at full speed. It was a machine not of one factory, but of thousands, scattered across a continent so vast it could seem almost without end to men from islands of limited space and resources. From Detroit to Chicago, Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, assembly lines once built for cars, radios, refrigerators, and toys had been stripped and retooled to answer a single question. How do you fight a global war and keep millions of men fed, clothed, and moving? The answer turned out to be a kind of engineering that went beyond weapons. Tanks and aircraft still rolled from the lines, but beside them came something more subtle. Systems to manage the lives that war disrupted, including the lives of captured enemies. By 1943, the United States had become expert at turning civilian abundance into military efficiency. Companies that had advertised soap and breakfast cereal were now bidding on contracts to make field rations, tents, and standardized clothing. Train schedules meshed with truck convoys and shipping lanes in a choreography precise enough to seem invisible until one looked closely. When the first Japanese prisoners stepped onto American soil, what astonished them was not simply kindness, but the scale and predictability of supply. Every meal that appeared in camp had been mapped weeks ahead on spreadsheets and ledgers few of them could imagine. Flour milled in Kansas traveled by rail to bakeries, contracted to supply soft bread by the ton. Meat from the Midwest moved through refrigerated train cars into federal depots, where it was portioned, canned, and sent forward. Vegetables came in bright cans stamped with expiration dates. Corn, beans, peas, mass-produced to last across oceans and seasons. Even the mustard and ketchup offered with hot dogs came from enormous plants, built to serve not a neighborhood, but a nation. The Americans did not stop at food. They treated morale itself as something that could be produced, packaged, and shipped. Baseball gloves and bats left sports equipment factories and entered quartermaster inventories just as surely as boots and helmets. Radios, books, and movie projectors were bought in bulk, parceled into kits, and dispatched to camps. A library might appear overnight inside a former fairground-turned-prison site. A stack of English dictionaries and simple Japanese texts could show up beside it. Where prisoners saw a field turned into a baseball diamond. What had happened was logistics. Trucks bringing chalk, bats, leather mitts, and canvas bases, all ordered with the same forms that summoned ammunition and spare parts. Electricity ran because the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planned each camp as a functioning town. Diesel generators were requisitioned in bulk. Plumbing fixtures came by freight and were installed to standard specifications. Water towers were built because blueprints existed long before any prisoner arrived. Uniforms, stamped with PW, were cut from cotton woven in southern mills, dyed in industrial vats, and sized in predictable patterns. Even the paper used for prisoner records and letters home was part of supply contracts negotiated far from any battlefield. To men raised in a nation where shortages defined daily life, where string was saved, cloth rewoven, and families bartered for scraps of metal, the scale of this system was almost incomprehensible. They watched delivery trucks enter camp gates each morning, disgorging food in sealed crates, medical supplies in gleaming tins, and recreation gear packed as neatly as weapons. Nothing seemed improvised. Nothing seemed on the edge of collapse. Some prisoners began to measure what they saw, with a soldier's eye for logistics. How many men did it take to build a mess hall like this? How far did the bread travel? How could meat stay fresh in this heat? The answers, when pieced together, told a story of industrial capacity so far beyond Japan's that comparison felt almost painful. On the islands they had defended, supply ships were scarce and vulnerable. Meals depended on whatever could be scavenged or captured. Here, enemy captives lived inside a system designed for redundancy and comfort, because the war machine had room for generosity. It was not mercy alone that built such camps. It was calculation. American planners understood that healthy prisoners required fewer guards and less medical intervention. Well-fed men did not riot. Structured recreation, baseball, lectures, small jobs, kept idle minds from trouble. But there was another, quieter aim as well, to demonstrate power through normalcy, to show, without speeches, what it meant to belong to a country so rich in production that even its prisoners could experience safety and routine. At night, as lights burned bright across compounds and trucks rattled away down paved access roads, men like Nakahara lay awake thinking about the silent system that made this possible. The hum of electric wires above their heads and the clatter of kitchen work after dark were proof of something more than victory. They were proof of a society that had learned to turn abundance into strategy. Each can of food, each crate of bats, each roll of wire for fences told a story of an economy mobilized but not exhausted. For men who had seen Japan stretch thin across an ocean, who had watched comrades starve in caves and trenches because supply had failed, the message was hard to ignore. America's wartime machine was not just fighting battles. It was feeding, housing, and even entertaining enemies while still pushing fresh divisions to the front. Long before these prisoners could put words to the realization, it was working on them. They had entered the camps expecting deprivation. Instead, they found a quiet lesson in industrial might. Abundance, it turned out, could be as decisive as firepower, and a system that could give light to barracks and baseball to bored captives was a system built to win wars far larger than any one island. The invitation came wordlessly, one late afternoon, when the air was heavy with the sweetness of cut grass and the hum of cicadas rose over the camp fence. 2 American trucks rolled in and stopped near the open field beyond the barracks. Guards hopped down and began unloading strange contraptions, metal drums cut in half, blackened with soot, fitted with grates that gleamed silver under the sun. Prisoners, released from their day's work in the laundry and kitchen, drifted toward the yard in small, hesitant groups. Drawn by curiosity, they tried to hide. From where Kiyoshi Nakahara stood, the scene looked almost theatrical. Americans laughed and shouted to one another as they worked, their voices easy and unguarded, their sleeves rolled high. One struck a match and coaxed flame from piles of charcoal until smoke curled skyward in fragrant grey ribbons. Soon another scent layered over it, sharp and unfamiliar, sizzling fat and spice, stronger than any dried fish or boiled barley he had known on the islands. The men around him stiffened at the smell. It was meat, clearly, but transformed, rich, fatty, almost intoxicating after months of thin soups and rice, measured grain by grain. The guards moved with a practiced rhythm, flipping long links of sausage with metal tongs, arranging buns in neat stacks on folding tables. Glass bottles clinked softly in crates nearby. The entire operation seemed to spring from nowhere, as if some hidden switch had been thrown, and the camp itself had decided to feast. Nakahara felt the first stirring of unease under his ribs. War had not ended. News from home was scarce and grim. Yet here was a picnic, built for men still officially enemies. When the call went out, simple gestures and a few shouted Japanese words learned for the occasion, many prisoners hung back. It had been drilled into them, beware the enemy's comfort, distrust gifts. Death was honorable. Captivity already carried shame. To stand in line for foreign food seemed to compound it. Still, hunger pressed hard. The work crews had eaten only bread and weak coffee that morning. The scent rising from the grills wrapped itself around empty stomachs with cruel efficiency. One of the first to step forward was a boy from Okinawa, barely more than a recruit, his uniform long gone. American-issue trousers belted tight around a shrinking waist. He took the offered bun as if it might burn him, then retreated to the edge of the field and examined it with wide eyes. The sausage steamed, juices pooling against the paper. He bit once, fast, and froze, then chewed again, slower, and something like relief passed across his face. Others saw. Hesitation cracked. Nakahara found himself in the slow-moving line before he had decided to join it. A guard behind the table handed him a plate. White bread so soft it sagged under the sausage's weight, a bright smear of mustard glistening in the sun. Another pressed a bottle into his other hand. The glass was cool and wet from ice somewhere unseen. The guard offered a small nod and turned to the next man. No speeches, no tricks, just food delivered with mechanical ease. He stepped aside and looked at the meal. The sausage was uniform, its casing taut and glossy. The bread had no crust worth noting, yet the smell was irresistible. Around him other prisoners bit cautiously, faces unreadable, then betrayed by quiet surprise. Nakahara raised the hot dog to his lips and bit. The taste startled him. Smoke, salt, fat, a faint tang of the yellow sauce. It was not refined, nothing subtle or seasonal about it. But it was warm and satisfying in a way that landed somewhere deep, beyond pride. He chewed and swallowed and realized only then how tight his jaw had been for months. A cheer rose nearby, not loud, but a quick bark of laughter, as one man fumbled the unfamiliar bottle cap and sprayed himself with the dark drink inside. Americans chuckled along. No one punished the clumsiness. The moment passed like a crack in a long silence. By the time the sun dipped behind the guard towers, the field had taken on an uneasy festival air. Smoke hung low and fragrant. Prisoners sat on grass or rough benches, eating in wary clusters, speaking softly in their own language. The guards moved among them without tension, some tossing a baseball back and forth, others leaning against trucks with arms folded and easy smiles. It felt wrong and right at once, a day shaped not by battle, but by routine human appetite. Nakahara watched one of the cooks douse a dying flame with water, steam hissing upward. Behind him, crates of uneaten buns and sausages remained, an abundance still strange to his eyes. Waste casual and unremarked would come next. He could already see wrappers blowing across the yard. He thought of home, where food scraps were saved, where hunger haunted every season, where surrender had seemed the greatest sin. Yet here he sat, eating the enemy's meat, alive and not despised, and could not deny the comfort warming his empty frame. The first cookout did not feel like kindness exactly. It felt like a message: we have so much we can feed even those who fought us. It unsettled something deep in him, not because it threatened violence, but because it threatened his sense of how the world worked. As night crept across the compound and lamps flickered on along the fences, he finished the last bite of his hot dog slowly, aware that something inside him, something long-armored, had shifted just a little under the weight of ordinary abundant food. In the hours after the first cookout, smoke drifted away. Unease lingered heavier than the scent of charred meat. The novelty of the day had not replaced years of training or the weight of belief carried from home. In the barracks, men sat on their bunks with untouched hot dogs cooling on paper or scraps of bun hidden under thin mattresses, as if even to throw them away might risk something. The air was thick with the smell of mustard drying and the low murmur of uneasy talk. Kiyoshi Nakahara leaned against the wall and listened to the familiar arguments. Some men whispered that the food was bait, a test meant to expose weakness. Others said the enemy's food would rot the spirit, that to eat too much was to forget who they were. A few older sergeants, their pride wound tight as rope, spoke in clipped, bitter tones. "We are still soldiers. We do not accept gifts from the enemy." But the words were brittle. Even as they were spoken, stomachs betrayed their owners with quiet groans. Hunger was a persistent, patient enemy, and it worked silently in the night. The day's work details, laundry, kitchen, repairs, burned through meager calories quickly. Rations before the cookout had been edible but uninspired. White bread, thin stew, coffee that tasted mostly of water. The new meat had filled bellies in a way nothing since capture had. For the men who had eaten, sleep came easier, muscles loosened. For those who refused, the night stretched long and sharp. Nakahara himself had eaten half his hot dog before stopping. Torn between the satisfaction of salt and fat and the voice of his father, warning of dishonor, he had set the other half aside and woken hours later with his gut aching, the smell of cooled grease filling the barracks like a taunt. In the bunk above him, a young conscript whispered to himself, restless with hunger and shame. Morning brought new routines, but also new temptations. The Americans seemed to know something about patience. They did not press the food again, did not mock refusals. Instead, they lived their ordinary lives in plain view. Guards unwrapped leftovers from the cookout and ate them slowly, laughing at some private joke. They drank from sweating bottles, wiped mustard from their chins with paper napkins, and tossed scraps to the gravel without a glance. Nothing bad happened. No one sickened. No one punished them for indulgence. For men trained to expect trickery, this quiet normalcy was more persuasive than words. By midday, whispers began to shift. A boy from Kyushu, stomach cramped from refusing dinner, asked his friend in a low voice what the hot dog had tasted like. The friend shrugged, embarrassed but honest. Strange but good, like meat and smoke. Others drifted closer to listen. The next work detail to the kitchen returned with small treasures, broken buns, bits of sausage dropped during cleanup. A sergeant who had refused everything the night before sat on the edge of his bunk now, chewing a ragged piece he claimed was for study. His face gave him away, the closed eyes, the slow swallow. By the second evening, the Americans staged no ceremony. They simply lit the grills again. No speeches, no invitations. Just smoke rising over the compound as if nothing unusual had happened. Hunger did the rest. One by one, men who had stood back the day before found themselves edging toward the smell, faces blank with forced indifference. They accepted the food wordlessly, some biting only after walking away, others eating openly now that the first shame had cracked. Nakahara took his portion without comment. The bun yielded easily, the sausage warm and steady in his hands. He told himself it was fuel for work, nothing more. But when the taste hit, salty, rich, utterly foreign, he could not stop at one bite. He finished the whole thing quickly, almost angrily, as though swallowing his own hesitation. Conversations after were quieter, but changed. Men who had eaten now spoke of it with careful detachment, describing flavor, guessing at ingredients. A few still refused and turned their backs, but their number was smaller, their protests thinner. The body has its own loyalties. When fed, it grows hard to deny. The Americans seemed to understand without gloating. They collected wrappers and bottles with the same unhurried efficiency, leaving behind only the faint smell of cooked meat and a strange new space between enemy and captor. It was not friendship, not even truce, just an easing of edges, a proof that survival could be simple if one allowed it. That night, Nakahara lay awake again, but his belly was full. The shame was still there, but dulled, mingled with something harder to name: curiosity. If the enemy could feed them so well, if nothing bad followed the breaking of taboo, what else about this war might be different from what he had been told? In the dark, the barracks was quieter than usual. Men slept deeper, hunger briefly silenced. Outside, a guard strolled past, humming a tune unfamiliar and light-hearted. The faint scent of charcoal lingered, seeping into the wood. Suspicion had not vanished. It would not vanish overnight, but hunger had breached the first wall. Where yesterday there had been only resistance and pride, tonight there was the first small, reluctant step toward acceptance, not of defeat, but of survival on different terms. It was a change subtle enough to miss if one wasn't listening closely. Yet for those who had lived for months on edge, it was unmistakable, a loosening in the chest, a tiny surrender not to the enemy, but to the undeniable pull of life itself. The next time the smell of grilled meat drifted through the camp, it met less silence and more watchful eyes. Hunger had opened a door. Now curiosity stepped through. Men who had eaten cautiously before returned to the line without needing to be coaxed. They moved slower than the Americans, but with less visible shame, studying the food as though it might give up its secrets if looked at long enough. Kiyoshi Nakahara found himself doing the same, turning the sausage in his hands, paying attention not only to taste, but to what it might reveal. It was a small thing: ground meat, pink in uniform, sealed in a skin that snapped faintly when bitten. But the more he thought, the stranger it seemed. He had grown up where meat was precious and irregular, a cut from a fish that was thinner on one side, a slice of pork saved for celebration, scraps boiled into broth until nothing but memory remained. Here was meat tamed into sameness, every link identical to the next, each one delivering the same salt, smoke, and fat. It was not artful. It was engineered. He remembered the war rations aboard ship: hard rice balls, dried anchovies, sometimes pickled plum if luck favored them. Each meal was a gamble against distance and spoilage. Rice grew mold, fish rotted, canned goods ran out. Ships could be sunk, supply lines cut. He had watched whole units ration themselves to sickness because nothing more would come for weeks. Yet here, thousands of miles from the factories that birthed them, these sausages appeared as if plucked from thin air. Word passed quietly among the prisoners that Americans did not butcher meat by hand for such things. Instead, entire animals were ground and mixed with spices, then stuffed into casings by machines. It wasted nothing. Even scraps became food, transformed into something sturdy, safe to ship, easy to cook. There was efficiency in that, a ruthless pragmatism dressed as casual abundance. A cook who had once served with the Imperial Navy whispered about assembly lines in Chicago and Cincinnati, places where meat flowed in and hot dogs came out by the thousands every hour. Such talk unsettled men raised to respect craft and scarcity. Japanese cuisine prized freshness and precision. A single fish carved carefully, rice washed by hand. Here was a different philosophy altogether: feed everyone, anywhere, quickly. Quality in the old sense might be sacrificed, but the result was reliable and plentiful. And reliable food wins wars as surely as guns. In the work details, men began noticing other clues. Crates stamped with identical logos, dates printed in neat rows, mustard arriving in tins, each one matching the last. Even the bread was standard, soft white, baked somewhere far away yet unchanged by travel. There was power hidden in that sameness. If you could make millions of hot dogs taste alike, you could make millions of anything: boots, bullets, trucks. Nakahara felt the weight of this realization one afternoon while helping unload a kitchen delivery. The Americans had allowed some prisoners to assist, an act of trust born of routine. He hefted a box and saw its contents, sausages wrapped in wax paper, labeled by lot number and factory code. He ran his hand over the smooth surface and thought of how many thousands of identical boxes must exist to make this small feast possible. Then he imagined what else those same factories might be turning out: shells, parts for planes, engines. It was all of a piece. Back in the barracks that night, the men talked softly. They no longer argued over whether to eat. The debate was settled. Now the question was what this food meant. Some laughed bitterly. Even our captors feed us scraps. But beneath the sarcasm was unease, because scraps transformed and multiplied into plenty spoke of a system Japan did not have. One sailor muttered that if such machines could feed prisoners this well, no wonder the Americans could keep whole armies moving. The change was subtle, but real. Each bite of sausage became less about hunger and more about understanding. Eating was no longer surrender. It was study. The same men who once spat at the bun now dissected it, pinched and examined its texture, guessed at the flour and yeast. They tasted mustard with suspicion first, then with something closer to respect, a tang sharp enough to cut through fat, clever in its simplicity. Someone joked that mustard alone might win a jungle campaign by keeping men willing to eat anything. The laughter that followed was thin but knowing. Nakahara could feel his own resistance shifting. He still missed rice, missed the careful hand of his mother shaping onigiri, but he could not deny the strange genius of what he held. These sausages did not pretend to be special. They promised only to fill, to travel, to last. And they kept that promise. Outside, the American world kept moving. Trucks rumbling in, lights glowing after dark, voices easy and confident. The hot dog was just one thread in a far larger fabric, but it was a thread he could touch, taste, and measure. It told him something profound about his enemy. They had built a way to feed millions without pause, and to do so while fighting across oceans. He thought of Japan's soldiers, gaunt and desperate in caves, and the contrast hurt in a way no wound ever had. That night, long after lights out, he lay awake, considering the meaning of that small engineered meal. It was not luxury. It was control. It was proof of a country that could turn waste into strength and make plenty feel effortless. He realized that whatever else the Americans had built, they had built a war machine out of food itself, a machine that reached even here, into a prison camp, to tell him quietly and unmistakably, "We will not run out." And perhaps that more than any weapon was the kind of power that wins wars. One morning, weeks after the first cookouts, the prisoners were marched past a field they had assumed was only for marching drills. It lay just beyond the main yard, an unremarkable stretch of trimmed grass bordered by chain link and a scatter of young maples. Until that day it had been empty, a quiet place where dew pooled at dawn and guards sometimes smoked in silence. Now it was changed. White lines ran clean and sharp across the green, chalk so bright it looked almost ceremonial. A low wooden backstop rose behind a flat patch of dirt. On either side, rough bleachers had appeared overnight, boards nailed across simple frames, still smelling of cut pine. The men slowed without meaning to. The geometry was unfamiliar and yet intentional. You could sense purpose in its symmetry, even if you did not know the rules. One of the Americans, cap pulled low against the sun, tapped the chalked line with his boot and said something in English too quick to catch. Another grinned and tossed a ball lazily into the air, white leather, bright seams, flashing red as it spun. "Baseball," one guard said clearly, as if the word alone could translate. A few prisoners murmured the syllables back, awkward in their mouths. To Kiyoshi Nakahara, it looked at first like play for children. The field was too open, the chalk too clean. War had taught him to see earth as cover and shadow. But here there was no place to hide, no trench or sandbag wall. The guards stood loose and laughing, swinging wooden bats they handled like extensions of their arms. They beckoned to no one in particular, only pantomimed, hitting an invisible enemy with casual grace. It seemed absurd. Men who had crossed seas to kill now, tossing a ball and smiling like boys at festival time. That evening, the prisoners spoke quietly about what they had seen. Some scoffed. "Games," muttered an older petty officer. "They train for nothing." Another said Americans wasted energy they should save for real combat. But the dismissal rang thin. Everyone had noticed the organization behind the scene. The chalk laid with military precision, the bleachers built as efficiently as the mess halls, the bats and gloves arriving in neat crates. Even this play was a product of some vast system. A few days later, the field was alive with noise. The guards had formed two teams, khaki shirts discarded for undershirts, and now they ran and shouted with a fervor that startled the watching prisoners. A crack of wood against leather echoed across the camp as the first ball flew high against the blue. A laughter followed the runners. Cheers rose and fell. No officer barked commands. There was no shame in losing, only more laughter and the slap of hands. Prisoners clustered along the fence to watch, curiosity tugging them closer despite themselves. Nakahara stood among them, arms crossed, eyes narrow. The movements were strange but graceful. The pitcher's wind-up, the batter's sudden swing, the sprint to a white square of cloth called a base. There was structure, but not the rigid, punishing kind he knew. This was order without fear, competition without hatred. What unsettled him most was the freedom in it. These men, guards of enemy prisoners, carried rifles hours before. Now they chased each other across the grass, faces unmasked by caution. War had not eaten them hollow. They seemed to draw strength from leisure itself. It was a kind of resilience he did not understand, a way of restoring energy through joy instead of solemn duty. As the innings wore on, an interpreter drifted among the prisoners explaining bits and pieces. 3 strikes, 4 balls, runs scored when a man circled the diamond and came home. The terms meant little at first, but the pattern revealed itself. The duel between pitcher and batter, the thrill of a long hit, the cheer when someone slid safely onto a base. Slowly, the watchers leaned forward, invested despite confusion. When the game ended, sweat-darkened Americans shook hands and clapped each other's backs. One tossed a ball gently over the fence. Startled, a young prisoner caught it. The leather was warm from the sun, seams biting gently into his palm. The guard smiled and waved him to keep it. The boy froze, then nodded stiffly, retreating to show his bunkmates. That night the ball passed from hand to hand, examined as if it were a coded message. In the following days, the diamond remained immaculate. Guards chalked it fresh each morning. Sometimes Americans played alone. Sometimes they invited prisoners to rake the dirt smooth or place new bases. No one was forced, but volunteers appeared. Work in the kitchen or laundry was dreary. The field was alive with something different. Nakahara went once, standing at the edge, while others tried catching the ball. He noticed how the Americans taught, no shouting, only patient gestures, laughter when someone missed and tried again. The first time a prisoner swung and connected, sending the ball skittering into the grass, the watching men could not help but cheer. It startled them. The sound of their own voices raised not in command, but in delight. He left that day uneasy and thoughtful. The game was simple, almost childish, yet it held a quiet strength. People who could build fields in wartime and still play seemed unbreakable in some deeper way. They had turned abundance not just into food and light, but into recreation. And from that came a spirit hard to crush. In his bunk that night, he pictured the diamond again, white lines glowing faint in the dusk, bats leaning against the fence like rifles at rest. He had thought play belonged to peace, but here it flourished in the middle of war, fed by the same vast machine that fed everything else. It was another lesson he did not want, but could not ignore. A nation that could afford joy while fighting could also afford to win. The baseball diamond did not stay empty for long. Once it was drawn and measured, the field seemed to summon life to itself. Guards played often, sometimes in the pale light of late afternoon, sometimes under the glare of flood lamps strung along the perimeter fence. The games were not idle chance. They were scheduled, announced with casual whistles, and always followed a pattern: stretch, toss, swing, cheer. At first, the prisoners watched only because there was little else to do. But as days turned to weeks, it became clear that these contests were not just pastime, they were policy. Kiyoshi Nakahara noticed it first in the rhythm of the camp. Americans valued routine the way his own officers valued silence. The day began with roll call and work details, yes, but also with plans for the evening game. You could hear it in snatches of talk while men unloaded supplies or swept the mess hall. Who would pitch tonight? Whether the right fielder's shoulder had healed? What teams would form? It was not trivial. It was part of a system meant to keep minds steady. He began to see that play here served the same function as parade drill in Japan, but with an entirely different spirit. In the Imperial Navy, order came through repetition and fear. You obeyed because punishment was near, and pride demanded perfection. Here, order seemed to grow out of shared enjoyment. The guards competed fiercely but laughed when they lost. They taunted one another lightly, then helped each other up after a hard slide. The result was unity without terror, discipline without the shadow of disgrace. This was not accident. The Americans had studied morale like engineers study steel. Nakahara overheard a young interpreter explaining to another prisoner that the army believed boredom bred trouble and despair. Soldiers idle too long turned restless. Prisoners idle too long turned dangerous. Better to give both purpose and recreation, to let energy burn harmlessly before it could ignite rebellion or despair. Games, music, reading, even the small libraries in the barracks, all were tools, not luxuries. The prisoners struggled to understand the psychology at work. Many had been taught that suffering forged strength. Denial was noble. Leisure softened men. Yet here were captors strong enough to play while winning a world-spanning war. They did not see games as weakness. They saw them as maintenance, like oiling a machine so it would not seize. It was an unfamiliar but persuasive logic. As weeks passed, the baseball diamond drew more volunteers. At first it was simple labor, raking the infield smooth, replacing chalk lines. But soon came shy participation. A guard would toss a ball gently to a prisoner. The man would flinch, then try to catch it. There were mistakes and dropped gloves, bursts of laughter from the Americans, then encouragement rather than mockery. Slowly, suspicion eased. Catching and throwing, running bases, learning signals, all felt strange, but also human. For men who had lived months on pure survival, the idea that organized play could keep one alive was disorienting. War had taught them that to relax was to die. Yet here they were, alive because their captors understood something about the human spirit they had not been taught. That rest and joy could be tactical. That a mind allowed to breathe did not break as easily. Nakahara noticed the effect on his own body first. Nights after work on the diamond left him tired but lighter. The knot in his chest loosened. The nightmares of sinking ships and starving crew came less often. He was ashamed to admit it, but grateful all the same. Others spoke quietly of the same change. Less pacing, better sleep, fewer bursts of hopeless anger. It dawned on them that these measures were not kindness alone. They were control, but an intelligent control. A calm, well-fed, occasionally amused prisoner was easier to manage than a desperate one. But there was power, too, in how effortless it seemed. The guards did not impose their will with fists. They shaped the environment until order felt almost natural. For Japanese officers like Nakahara, who had been taught that fear was the spine of discipline, this revelation was deeply unsettling. If men could be governed by contentment and routine as easily as by terror, then much of what they believed about leadership began to crumble. The Americans were not sentimental. They were practical. They created stability by giving just enough comfort to neutralize despair, just enough play to blunt rage. One late afternoon, he sat in the bleachers while a game unfolded. A guard sprinted to catch a fly ball, missed, rolled laughing into the grass. His teammates jeered good-naturedly, and the game moved on without pause. Nakahara thought of his own officers. A single mistake in drill could bring humiliation or blows. Here, failure was corrected but not punished. The team's strength seemed to rise from resilience, not fear. The realization left him quiet and uneasy. If a nation could build such resilience into its soldiers and its systems, even into its treatment of enemies, how much harder would it be to break? He looked at the diamond, at the ease with which Americans restored their own morale in the midst of war, and felt a chill deeper than any threat of violence. That night, back in the barracks, the murmurs among the men were different. They still feared defeat, still missed home, but something else had taken root, the sense that the enemy's power was not only in factories and ships, but in understanding how people function. A country that could weaponize play was a country built to endure. For Nakahara, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. The ball, the bat, the lines on the grass were not toys. They were proof of a quiet strength that no code of sacrifice alone could match. And beneath the lamps ringing the field, while Americans laughed and prisoners watched, the truth settled slowly. This, too, was war, just fought by other means. The first time a prisoner crossed the chalk lines, it happened almost without anyone noticing. One of the younger men, thin and restless, had been watching for days as Americans tossed the ball before evening games. He stood at the fence, following each arc with his eyes. When a foul tip skittered into the dust near his boots, he bent, hesitated, then threw it back. His motion was awkward, but clean enough to make the guard on the other side grin. The guard tossed it once more, gently this time. The boy caught it, clumsy but determined, and the prisoners nearby let out a surprised laugh. Something small cracked open in that moment, softer than surrender, louder than silence. After that, other gestures followed. A cook assigned to clear trays at the end of dinner stayed behind to watch batting practice. A petty officer volunteered for field maintenance, his rake smoothing infield dirt until it gleamed pale under the sun. Curiosity spread like water through dry soil. The men said little about it, but more of them found reasons to linger near the diamond. It began with learning how to hold the ball. The leather felt strange, stitched and firm, heavier than it looked. Guards demonstrated with pantomime, fingers across seams, wrist loose, elbow high. Language hardly mattered. Motion carried the meaning. Prisoners mirrored the movement stiffly at first, their pride as brittle as their unused muscles. But a caught throw brought a nod, and a nod invited another try. Batting was stranger still. To swing at something coming toward you felt wrong, almost reckless. They had been taught to brace, to defend, to strike only with purpose. Here timing and fluidity mattered more than force. When one man finally connected, a thin line drive that startled even him, the cheer that went up on both sides of the fence was sharp and brief, then died into embarrassed quiet. Yet the sound lingered in the ears of those who heard it. Rules took shape slowly, like a language half remembered. 3 strikes meant out. 4 missed throws meant you walked to first base. The bases themselves puzzled everyone. Why run in a square? Why not simply race straight and back again? But watching the Americans made it clearer. The game was not only about speed or strength. It was about sequence, about trust that the man behind you would do his part. The idea of passing responsibility along the line, of victory coming from shared rhythm, rather than individual heroics, felt new and a little dangerous. Nakahara learned to throw before he learned to understand. His first tosses wobbled and died short. A guard caught one easily and threw back with a slow looping arc, inviting no shame. Soon his arm found memory and the ball began to fly true. Batting took longer. He swung hard and missed, swung again and missed worse. Laughter rose, but not cruelly. Even the Americans laughed at themselves when they failed. Each miss felt less like disgrace and more like permission to try again. It unsettled him to realize how quickly laughter replaced fear on the field. In training back home, failure was punished or at least shamed into silence. Here it seemed woven into learning, even celebrated when followed by improvement. That kind of freedom bred a quiet courage. You risked embarrassment and discovered nothing lethal waited on the other side. Cheering was perhaps the strangest thing of all. At first the Japanese men stood silent, unsure if noise belonged to victors alone. But as they watched, they saw that applause belonged to anyone making an effort. A long hit earned claps even from the losing side. A good catch drew whistles regardless of uniform. When the first prisoner clapped for a guard's clean double, a ripple of nervous chuckles spread, but the guard tipped his cap, and no rebuke came. Later, when one of their own slid into base and stood grinning, other prisoners found their hands clapping before their minds decided to allow it. Something shifted each time this happened. The game stayed a game, but inside the rules was a new way of being with others. Teamwork here meant not obedience, but trust. There was no commander, only players who needed one another. It asked for alertness, yes, but also a lightness none of them had practiced in years. Evenings changed tone as the practice sessions grew. Men returned to barracks dusty but laughing softly. They spoke about who had caught well, who had run fast, who might bat next time. Old rivalries and rank mattered less out there. The game reshuffled status in a way nothing else had. A former petty officer might strike out, while a young cook hit clean and fast. Pride bent but did not break. It adapted. Nakahara felt the quiet revolution inside himself most sharply after one small play. He fielded a slow grounder cleanly, and without thinking, tossed it to a waiting guard at first base. The out was obvious. Cheers rose from both sides, easy and unforced. He stood stunned for a heartbeat, then found himself smiling. It was not alliance, not forgiveness, but something more neutral and more human. Shared satisfaction in a simple thing done right. That night, he lay awake, listening to low conversation ripple through the barracks. Men compared calluses from swinging bats, teased each other for missed catches, speculated about tomorrow's game. War felt far away for a moment, though defeat still pressed like a shadow at the edge of thought. What surprised him was how alive he felt, alive in a way that had nothing to do with survival drills or stubborn willpower. He did not yet know if this was dangerous, this easing of distance between self and enemy, or if it was simply life-reclaiming space where death had crowded too long. But he knew the rules now, at least enough to play, and in learning them, he had stumbled into a truth his teachers had never offered. There is strength in joy, and sometimes even enemies can share a breath of it without losing themselves. The first time the fence seemed to disappear was not during some grand gesture, but because of a single mistake. A guard at bat swung hard and lost his grip. The wooden club spun like a thrown propeller, landing in the dirt a few feet from the watching prisoners. For a moment there was silence, everyone unsure if this was danger or joke. Then the guard bent double, laughing at himself, and one of the prisoners, a wiry deckhand from Nagasaki, barked out a surprised laugh of his own. It startled everyone, including him. More chuckles followed, hesitant at first, then contagious. That sound, the strange blend of accents and laughter, felt like a door nudged open. After that, other small accidents became opportunities. A ball bounced off someone's chest and rolled away. A runner tripped on a base and tumbled awkwardly before popping up with a sheepish grin. An over-eager swing tore a hole in a borrowed shirt. Each time, Americans roared and prisoners grinned, and the silence that had once defined the yard began to fracture. Kiyoshi Nakahara found himself laughing despite every instinct. The first time, it happened when a young interpreter tried to explain home run and got the gesture wrong, waving arms in a frantic circle that looked more like panic than celebration. Everyone laughed, guards, prisoners, even the stoic older officers, and for once no shame followed the sound. It was only laughter, sharp and human, cutting through months of quiet tension. At the start, men would cover their mouths quickly, as if to hide the impulse. They were not ready to admit they could find humor in this place. But repetition dulled caution. Americans laughed easily and often. It was hard not to catch the rhythm. They ribbed each other without cruelty, slapping backs, calling out in slang no one understood, but everyone recognized as playful. Slowly, prisoners learned the difference between mockery and camaraderie, Some of the guards, perhaps sensing how brittle pride could be, teased themselves first. A dropped popfly earned exaggerated groans from their own team, inviting everyone to join in. One even performed a dramatic feint after striking out, collapsing in the dust while his friends jeered affectionately. The prisoners, startled at first, began to copy small gestures, an eye roll, a shrug when they missed a catch. Tentative smiles turned into full grins, then into real laughter that shook shoulders and made bellies ache. Nakahara noticed how different it felt from the forced merriment of his naval training, where laughter belonged only to superiors and never to mistakes. Here error was folded into belonging. To laugh at your own failure was not disgrace, but invitation. Come, be part of the game. We all stumble. That lesson cut deep. Afternoons after games began to change tone. Men returned to the barracks, flushed with exercise and something lighter. Conversation grew louder, dotted with chuckles as they retold each day's mishaps. The guard who slid past base and landed flat on his back. The prisoner who forgot to run after hitting and had to be shoved forward by laughing teammates. Even those who hadn't played came to watch, eager for the comedy of ordinary clumsiness. Guards started small traditions. One carried a scrap of fabric as a prize for the most spectacular blunder, tying it mock seriously around the loser's arm until the next game. Prisoners learned enough English to catch phrases like "nice try" and "safe," and to answer with shy smiles or mumbled thanks. The Americans, for their part, picked up simple Japanese words for good play. The exchange was uneven but genuine, language stitched together by gesture and grin. It was not peace, not even close. The war still loomed beyond the wire. News of bombings and lost cities reached the camp in faint, painful ripples. Many prisoners still carried deep wounds of loyalty and grief. But for the length of a game, for the heartbeat of a shared laugh, the world thinned. One afternoon, Nakahara himself tripped while running to first base, sprawling in the dirt to a chorus of groans and cheers. He expected humiliation to burn hot, but instead found himself laughing first, brushing dust from his hands, while a guard helped him up with a quick, firm pull. The laughter from both sides swelled and folded back on itself until it was impossible to tell who had started it. That night, lying on his bunk, he thought about how strange and powerful the moment had been. No one had used rank or shame. No one had punished failure. Instead, it had turned into connection, fragile but undeniable. He realized how deeply he had feared becoming less than a soldier by accepting the enemy's terms. Yet what happened on that field had not taken his dignity. It had given it back in a different form, the dignity of surviving, of being human before being anything else. The guards, too, seemed changed. They moved among the prisoners with less stiffness, more ordinary ease. Not friends, not equals, but no longer faceless enemies either. Something about laughing together had humanized both sides. The game remained a boundary they could meet across without threat. As the weeks passed, the sound of joint laughter became part of the camp's fabric. It drifted through the yard at dusk, mixed with the smell of dust and sweat, surprising men who once thought they would die before sharing any warmth with their captors. Each laugh was small, but together they chipped away at fear, building a quiet, temporary truce that no treaty had promised but hunger and play had made possible. And in that unlikely noise was a glimpse of something beyond war, the stubborn, returning pulse of life. The first time the fence seemed to disappear was not during some grand gesture, but because of a single mistake. A guard at bat swung hard and lost his grip. The wooden club spun like a thrown propeller, landing in the dirt a few feet from the watching prisoners. For a moment, there was silence, everyone unsure if this was danger or joke. Then the guard bent double, laughing at himself, and one of the prisoners, a wiry deckhand from Nagasaki, barked out a surprised laugh of his own. It startled everyone, including him. More chuckles followed, hesitant at first, then contagious. That sound, the strange blend of accents and laughter, felt like a door nudged open. After that, other small accidents became opportunities. A ball bounced off someone's chest and rolled away. A runner tripped on a base and tumbled awkwardly before popping up with a sheepish grin. An over-eager swing tore a hole in a borrowed shirt. Each time, Americans roared and prisoners grinned, and the silence that had once defined the yard began to fracture. Kiyoshi Nakahara found himself laughing despite every instinct. The first time, it happened when a young interpreter tried to explain home run and got the gesture wrong, waving arms in a frantic circle that looked more like panic than celebration. Everyone laughed, guards, prisoners, even the stoic older officers, and for once no shame followed the sound. It was only laughter, sharp and human, cutting through months of quiet tension. At the start, men would cover their mouths quickly, as if to hide the impulse. They were not ready to admit they could find humor in this place. But repetition dulled caution. Americans laughed easily and often. It was hard not to catch the rhythm. They ribbed each other without cruelty, slapping backs, calling out in slang no one understood, but everyone recognized as playful. Slowly, prisoners learned the difference between mockery and camaraderie. Some of the guards, perhaps sensing how brittle pride could be, teased themselves first. A dropped popfly earned exaggerated groans from their own team, inviting everyone to join in. One even performed a dramatic feint after striking out, collapsing in the dust while his friends jeered affectionately. The prisoners, startled at first, began to copy small gestures, an eye roll, a shrug when they missed a catch. Tentative smiles turned into full grins, then into real laughter that shook shoulders and made bellies ache. Nakahara noticed how different it felt from the forced merriment of his naval training, where laughter belonged only to superiors and never to mistakes. Here error was folded into belonging. To laugh at your own failure was not disgrace, but invitation. Come, be part of the game. We all stumble. That lesson cut deep. Afternoons after games began to change tone. Men returned to the barracks, flushed with exercise and something lighter. Conversation grew louder, dotted with chuckles as they retold each day's mishaps. The guard who slid past base and landed flat on his back. The prisoner who forgot to run after hitting and had to be shoved forward by laughing teammates. Even those who hadn't played came to watch, eager for the comedy of ordinary clumsiness. Guards started small traditions. One carried a scrap of fabric as a prize for the most spectacular blunder, tying it mock seriously around the loser's arm until the next game. Prisoners learned enough English to catch phrases like "nice try" and "safe," and to answer with shy smiles or mumbled thanks. The Americans, for their part, picked up simple Japanese words for good play. The exchange was uneven but genuine, language stitched together by gesture and grin. It was not peace, not even close. The war still loomed beyond the wire. News of bombings and lost cities reached the camp in faint, painful ripples. Many prisoners still carried deep wounds of loyalty and grief. But for the length of a game, for the heartbeat of a shared laugh, the world thinned. One afternoon, Nakahara himself tripped while running to first base, sprawling in the dirt to a chorus of groans and cheers. He expected humiliation to burn hot, but instead found himself laughing first, brushing dust from his hands, while a guard helped him up with a quick, firm pull. The laughter from both sides swelled and folded back on itself until it was impossible to tell who had started it. That night, lying on his bunk, he thought about how strange and powerful the moment had been. No one had used rank or shame. No one had punished failure. Instead, it had turned into connection, fragile but undeniable. He realized how deeply he had feared becoming less than a soldier by accepting the enemy's terms. Yet what happened on that field had not taken his dignity. It had given it back in a different form, the dignity of surviving, of being human before being anything else. The guards, too, seemed changed. They moved among the prisoners with less stiffness, more ordinary ease. Not friends, not equals, but no longer faceless enemies either. Something about laughing together had humanized both sides. The game remained a boundary they could meet across without threat. As the weeks passed, the sound of joint laughter became part of the camp's fabric. It drifted through the yard at dusk, mixed with the smell of dust and sweat. surprising men who once thought they would die before sharing any warmth with their captors. Each laugh was small, but together they chipped away at fear, building a quiet, temporary truce that no treaty had promised but hunger and play had made possible. And in that unlikely noise was a glimpse of something beyond war, the stubborn, returning pulse of life. By midsummer, the camp had settled into a rhythm that felt impossible to ignore. Meals came 3 times a day without fail. Grills flared on weekends, their smoke curling over the fence like a quiet flag. Games unfolded on the diamond, with clockwork regularity, chalk lines drawn and redrawn, bats cracking against leather in crisp evening air. What once felt like isolated oddities, the strange sausage, the laughing contests of baseball, began to reveal a deeper pattern. None of this was chance. Kiyoshi Nakahara noticed it first when he found himself watching the supply trucks instead of the players. Each day, vehicles arrived, rumbling in from roads that stretched out to a continent he could hardly imagine. They came loaded not only with food, but with everything the camp seemed to need. Gloves and bats in one shipment, lumber and paint in another, crates of fresh uniforms stacked like bricks. It was not random. Some system somewhere had mapped it all so exactly that nothing ran short, not even for men who were technically enemies. He remembered the long months aboard ship when Japanese supply lines had withered, food spoiled before reaching front lines. Weapons ran dry. Soldiers boiled leather for soup. Outposts starved in caves while waiting for relief convoys that never came. Here in enemy hands, he lived inside a machine that anticipated and delivered with unthinking ease. He began to feel a chill that no sunshine could dispel. If America could do this for prisoners, what could it do for its own armies? The hot dog itself became a kind of symbol. At first it had been novelty, then sustenance, then curiosity. Now it stood for something larger, an empire of production that took scraps and turned them into endless fuel. If sausage and bread could reach a remote camp in the Midwest on time and in quantity, so could ammunition and engines to the Pacific. The same assembly lines that ground meat also stamped rifle parts, cast tank treads, and rolled ship hulls. The same railways that carried buns and mustard also carried Sherman tanks and B-29 wings. Baseball told a similar truth in different language. To build a field overnight in a place meant only for containment was to declare mastery of resources. It required wood, chalk, gloves, balls, and men to lay them out while war raged across oceans. Leisure, Nakahara began to understand, was not a luxury for these people. It was a byproduct of strength. Only a nation secure in its supply could spare time and energy to keep morale alive, to let its soldiers and even its captives remain human. This recognition unsettled the men more than any threat could have. A guard's rifle reminded them of danger. A functioning baseball league reminded them of defeat. A rifle could be countered with bravery. A system this vast and smooth seemed unassailable. It produced not just weapons, but normal life in the middle of war, and that normal life fed the fighters who came for them. Letters never sent, but whispered aloud, reflected this dawning understanding. "If they can feed us this way," one man said softly to his bunkmates, "imagine they're Marines." Another, a former ship's engineer, shook his head over the endless ice in the Americans' drinks, cold water for prisoners. Think what they have at sea. Nakahara felt it every time he bit into the plain meal offered by men who had no reason to care if he starved. This was not mercy. It was proof. The enemy's system was so deep and confident it could afford generosity without risk. He could not imagine Japan managing such abundance for its own wounded, let alone for those it captured. Even the easy smiles of the guards took on new weight. They laughed because they could. Their supply was sure. Their future, at least in this war, felt secure enough to make room for play. In them was a kind of power unfamiliar to men taught, that strength came only from sacrifice and silence. As weeks passed, the cookouts and baseball games stopped feeling like strange gifts and became daily evidence of a different world order. Each sausage handed across the table was a quiet statement. We have built something that will not run out. Each swing of the bat said, We are strong enough to relax and still win. At night, the prisoners lay awake and let these small, relentless signals sink in. They had believed empires were forged only by spirit and steel. But here was another empire, one built of assembly lines and refrigerated trains, of predictable delivery schedules and morale science. It fought with weapons, but also with abundance, with the ability to make life feel normal even while fighting on two oceans. The realization was slow and bitter. They were not only defeated by guns and ships, but by an idea that strength could be measured in how easily a nation could provide. America's empire seemed to stretch as naturally as breath, feeding armies and enemies alike without pause. When Nakahara next watched the diamond alive with players, he saw no softness. He saw victory rehearsed in small, harmless acts, the constant supply of balls and bats, the effortless leisure built on unimaginable labor. The hot dogs, once strange, now tasted of quiet conquest. And he knew that while battles decided islands, it was this invisible network, feeding and amusing even its prisoners, that would decide the war itself. Long after the games ended and the smoke from the grills had faded, the barracks would go quiet but not fully still. Lantern light glowed faint and yellow, and the sound of pencils scratching against paper took the place of talk. Not everyone wrote, many men could not bring themselves to, but those who did found something healing in the small ritual. Kiyoshi Nakahara, who had kept a log at sea, began again out of habit at first, then with a strange compulsion he could not name. The paper came from the Americans. At first this alone felt humiliating. Stationery stamped with neutral markings, thin envelopes, pencils sharpened and handed out at evening call. But the guards offered them without condescension, and soon there was no use resisting. Men sat cross-legged on bunks or hunched over tables, shaping neat characters in the dim light. The act felt almost secret, though no one stopped them. Some wrote letters to families they could no longer reach. Nakahara began with formal lines to his parents in Yokohama. "I am alive, though ashamed to say so. The enemy holds me, but not cruelly. The camp is orderly and strange. You would not believe it." Then he hesitated and did not finish, uncertain if the censors would allow such words or if the letter would ever cross the ocean. He folded the page carefully and tucked it between his mattress and bunk frame, unsent but somehow necessary. Others wrote diaries for themselves, a place to untangle what no conversation could. The entries were uneven, short, factual notes one night, then longer bursts of thought another. One sailor, barely 20, confided to his pages that the first bite of the enemy's bread had broken something inside him, though he could not decide if it was pride or hunger. Another described the baseball field in exacting detail, the smell of pine boards, the sound of laughter he had thought belonged only to peace. "Here, even our captors throw picnics," he wrote in halting script. "I do not know what to think." The contradictions pressed on them. They had been told to expect starvation and torment, yet here they counted calories they could not have dreamed of on campaign. They were told the enemy feared work and discipline, yet everything around them ran on invisible order. They were told Americans could not endure hardship, yet these camps were built and supplied while their fleets and armies still fought an ocean away. The page became the only place to admit such heresy without consequence. At night, when a guard's footsteps faded down the gravel path, men would quietly pass small folded papers to each other. Sometimes it was a borrowed diary for a quick look, sometimes just a phrase someone had written and wanted another to see. One such note came to Nakahara from a bunkmate, a former teacher from Nagasaki. "If we were weak, would we treat enemies this well?" The sentence burned more than any insult could have. He slipped it back without answer, but it stayed with him. In these writings, a new kind of doubt took root, not betrayal of home or emperor, but an honest wondering about the world beyond the fences. What if the picture of strength they had grown up with was incomplete? What if survival and prosperity came not from endless sacrifice, but from building systems that worked? The questions were quiet, dangerous even to think. But they lived on the page. Some men shaped their entries like intelligence reports, noting details of supply convoys and kitchen stores, believing the information might matter one day. Others wrote in almost poetic tones about the shock of plenty after years of want. A pilot described his first hot dog as a small machine of meat and smoke, made somewhere I cannot imagine, and brought here by a force larger than any fleet. For many, the writing was less about record and more about keeping a self alive that war had tried to erase. The paper took confession safely. It asked nothing but truth. Here they could say what hunger and silence had denied, that fear was loosening, that curiosity was growing where hatred had once lived. Nakahara wrote often about the baseball games. Not because he loved them, he still felt awkward, slow, his throws weak, but because they puzzled him. He wrote, "They laugh when they fail. We are taught to hide failure. Which way is stronger?" It frightened him to ask, but the question refused to leave. None of them knew whether these words would ever see home. Some letters were eventually approved, cleaned of detail, and sent across the sea, but most remained tucked into boots, folded under blankets, or hidden in small cracks behind boards. Yet the act of writing itself carried weight. It forced them to translate bewilderment into sentences, and in doing so, admit the cracks in the old picture of the enemy. There were nights when the barracks hummed softly with this secret labor. Pens scratching, paper rustling, an occasional sigh. Outside, the lights of the guard towers threw steady circles on the ground, and somewhere downfield, a stray ball might thump softly against a fence left standing after dusk practice. War was not gone. The news still brought word of cities burning, families suffering. But within the wire, men who had been taught to die rather than doubt found themselves questioning in ink. It was a quiet rebellion, not against country, but against untruth. Each unsent letter, each hidden diary entry was a private act of survival and a first step toward understanding. They had not chosen to be students of their captors, yet they were learning all the same. And in the hush of night, beneath the hum of electric bulbs and the faint smell of pine from the baseball bleachers, the seeds of new thinking were being planted page by page. The day the war ended arrived quietly, carried on a crackling loudspeaker rather than gunfire. It was August, the sky white with heat, the grass around the baseball diamond brittle underfoot. Work details had just returned to barracks for the midday rest when the command post summoned everyone to the yard. Guards fumbled with the radio, a boxy set perched on a crate, its antenna quivering in the humid air. At first, there was only static and English too fast to follow. Then a Japanese voice came, formal and strained, reading words that froze every man where he stood. The Emperor had spoken. Japan would accept surrender. It felt impossible and yet final, a soundless blow landing somewhere deep inside their ribs. Men who had survived ships and firestorms now swayed like trees in wind. Some dropped to their knees without realizing. Some stared straight ahead, expressionless. The yard filled with a stillness heavier than any command. For a long time, no one moved. The Americans, too, seemed uncertain. They lowered their rifles, but did not step forward, faces caught between duty and sympathy. A few caps came off quietly, a gesture of respect more powerful for its lack of words. Then one guard, perhaps too young to remember other wars, looked at the prisoners not with victory, but with a kind of weary relief. He went to the cook shack and came back with a box of baseballs, setting them on the ground like an offering. The next day, the grills came out. No orders, no speeches, just smoke rising once more into late summer sky. Bread and meat, mustard and bottles. The familiar smell that had once been suspicion, but was now something closer to comfort. The prisoners came hesitantly at first, still stunned by the news, but hunger and exhaustion drew them forward. Americans lined up too, not apart this time but alongside. Plates passed hand to hand without ceremony. The baseball field filled again, though slowly. A few men, Japanese and American, began to throw underhand, tentative and almost shy. Then someone swung a bat and connected. The crack was bright and sharp, and a cheer rose from both sides, surprised and unplanned. Soon teams had formed. Not strictly captor and captive, but a mix born of whoever stepped forward. Language mattered little. Gestures and grins handled what words could not. It was a strange, gentle chaos. Men who days earlier had faced each other as enemies now sprinted the same bases, kicking up dust and laughing at clumsy slides. A prisoner stole second, and an American catcher laughed so hard he forgot to throw. Another prisoner, once feared for his rank, tripped and went sprawling. Guards helped him up, patting his back until the dazed smile returned. Nakahara stood for a long time at the edge before joining. The surrender had hollowed him. Everything he had believed about honor lay scattered. Yet here was a game that asked nothing but presence. When a guard waved him over and tossed a glove, he slipped his hand inside, almost without thinking. The leather was warm, faintly oiled. A ground ball came his way. He scooped it and threw to first, and the cheer that rose felt honest and strange. For the length of that inning, there were no winners or losers, only men finding movement again after months of waiting. Food followed the play. Long tables were dragged into shade, plates filled high. Some prisoners still flinched when Americans approached, but the younger guards made it easy, passing condiments, showing how to load buns without spilling, raising bottles in quiet salute. Laughter came easier now, not the brittle kind of earlier games, but low and real, breaking tension like ice cracking on a thawing river. As dusk fell, the radio played soft music in English and Japanese alike. Some prisoners hummed without knowing the tune. Some Americans joined in with nonsense syllables. The air smelled of smoke and warm bread, and the fences, though still there, felt less like walls and more like lines on the field. Boundaries everyone could see, but no one needed to test that night. For Nakahara, the moment was unbearably complex. Relief that the killing was over, tangled with grief for the cost paid. Shame for defeat met a fragile hope that maybe life could continue. Yet there was also an unexpected steadiness in seeing the enemy up close, laughing with grease on their hands and dust on their knees. They were human, frighteningly competent but human all the same. He sat later under the eaves of the barracks, diary open on his knees. His hand shook as he wrote, "Today the war ended. We ate together. We played together. I do not know what to feel. Perhaps no one does. But we are alive, and that is something." Around him, other men wrote or sat silent, some staring into the twilight where the baseball diamond still glowed faintly with chalk. The Americans did not celebrate with cruelty. They did not shout victory or force humiliation. They simply worked to make the day survivable, for themselves as much as for the defeated. The cookouts and the games, once lessons in power, now became bridges. They gave shape to a silence too heavy to bear alone. By the time the lamps were switched off and night took the camp, a fragile new order had settled, not friendship, not forgiveness, but coexistence born of exhaustion and shared relief. War had ended. Hunger was eased. For one evening, bat and ball, bread and smoke, had built a small island of humanity inside wire still sharp with barbs. And though tomorrow would bring repatriation and reckoning, tonight there was enough room for men to breathe. The departure came in stages, slow and careful, as though everyone needed time to believe it was real. The war was finished. Papers signed far away were now trickling down to this quiet Midwestern camp. Names were called each morning. Men sorted into groups bound for rail depots and ports. The guards checked lists with the same methodical calm they had shown all along. Prisoners turned former soldiers packed what little they owned, letters folded deep in pockets, notebooks crammed with months of restless thought. Small tokens scavenged from camp life, a scuffed baseball, a bottle cap, a stub of pencil. Kiyoshi Nakahara felt the weight of leaving long before the gates opened. He walked one last time around the baseball field, its chalk lines pale and fading, but still there. Grass had grown back where hundreds of footsteps had worn it down, yet the shape of the diamond lingered. He could smell the ghosts of cookouts too, faint smoke baked into the wood of the bleachers. This field had been many things. First a curiosity, then an affront, finally a strange classroom. He bent to touch the dirt, dry and powdery, and wondered if memory could be carried like soil on a boot. The journey home began by train. Long hours of clattering wheels and blurred countryside. The men were quiet, each locked in thought. There was relief to be alive, but also dread for what waited in a homeland they no longer knew. Rumors said cities were flattened, ports ruined, food scarce. They would arrive not as heroes, but as survivors. Some feared even as traitors for surrendering. Yet tucked among these fears were images impossible to shake. Clean water from endless taps. A game that turned enemies into teammates for an hour. Bread that appeared on time every day. When the ships finally crossed the Pacific, the prisoners crowded the railings and stared east. Japan's coastline rose pale from mist, not triumphant, but battered and hungry. As harbors came into view, they saw rubble and fishing boats pulled high on broken docks. Relief was swallowed by shock. This was home, but not the home they had left. In the weeks that followed, those who had been captives scattered back to towns and cities trying to breathe again. Many said little of their captivity. Shame hung too heavy to speak freely, yet what they carried seeped out in quiet ways. Some wrote reports for what remained of the Navy or civil planners, describing the American supply systems they had glimpsed. Others shared practical lessons without naming the source. How to move goods efficiently, how to produce food cheaply and at scale, how to keep men occupied so despair would not eat them alive. Factories struggling to restart took note. An engineer who had once stood in a dusty American camp kitchen now sketched ways to standardize tools and packaging. A former petty officer haunted by wasted rations during the war advocated for better preservation methods. Teachers returned to classrooms and found themselves questioning old certainties. Perhaps joy and learning had a place even in hardship. Nakahara tried first just to survive, finding work at a port where broken ships were being scavenged for steel. Yet at night he opened his notebook and reread entries. The hot dog, dissected like a machine, the baseball game where laughter came unforced, the efficiency that fed armies and captives alike. Slowly, he began to believe these observations were not weakness, but knowledge. He started sharing them with other dock workers when talk turned to hunger and rebuilding. If scraps could feed thousands, why not us? If play could steady spirits, why not here? Small clubs sprang up among returnees, informal, almost secret at first, men meeting to talk about what they had seen and how it might fit a new Japan. They did not glorify defeat. They tried to extract something useful from it. Stories passed quietly about how abundance could be engineered, how morale could be built rather than demanded. One man taught children baseball with makeshift gloves, believing the game's cooperative spirit could heal young minds. Another worked to organize better canteens for dock crews, convinced that a fed and rested worker would rebuild faster than one, running on fear. Change was subtle, sometimes invisible, but it spread. The post-war world was hungry for ideas that worked, not just ideals. And these men, shaped by shock and survival, brought back unexpected blueprints, how to feed on little but feed many, how to give people reason to wake each day beyond obedience alone. Nakahara would never forget the sting of surrender or the faces of those who hadn't returned. Yet with time, grief turned to something more practical. He married, raised children who played baseball in dusty lots, taught them that losing a game was not shame, but chance to try again. He helped organize food drives when rations were thin, remembering how even prisoners had eaten. He did not think of it as honoring the enemy. He thought of it as refusing to waste what he had learned at such cost. The empire he had believed in had fallen. Another, larger one had shown him its quiet underpinnings, organization, adaptation, the power of shared life. Japan would have to build differently now, and he would help however he could. On nights when summer air hung thick and the smell of grilled meat drifted from alley cook stalls, he sometimes closed his eyes and saw the camp again. Smoke curling, bats cracking, a field that had once seemed alien and then strangely hopeful. Those memories were heavy but also alive. Reminders that defeat need not end a man's usefulness. You could take what you learned, even from an enemy, and build something better for those who came after. And so he did, one quiet, ordinary day at a time.